If there were a common cause for everything that goes wrong in a society, what would that common cause be? Some would say greed. The people too self-absorbed with financial gain to see beyond their paychecks tend to break things. Some would say lust, that the insatiable desire for money, power, and sex, among other things, can overwhelm the best of men to do the worst of things. Some, particularly Christians, would say pride, that thinking more of yourself, your ideas, and your capabilities than you otherwise would tends to get you in trouble more often than tends to keep you safe. All these answers hold weight, of course. I've fallen victim to all of them more times than I can count. I'm sure many of you are in the same boat as me. However, I still don't believe they're hitting the root of the issue, the core of what has led our culture down a rabbit hole of chaos. Every problem, as you've heard me say innumerable times at this point, is a values problem. When you see something wrong in the world, there is undoubtedly something wrong with the value system around or in that something. Obsessing over this concept for more than 6 years now, I've come to a conclusion about just how these value-induced problems occur. The trigger point for value-centered problems is simple: a misalignment or misprioritization of values. You should value one thing higher than something else, but you invert it anyway. Instead of FaceTiming your wife on a business trip, you sleep with a college student at the front desk. Rather than face your financial troubles at your business by filing for bankruptcy, you embezzle funds to keep your own gravy train going. Rather than tell your child the hard truth about something they did wrong, you affirm them and set them up for greater failure down the road, one that will surely cost them more than the present one. Why does this happen? The better path is obvious to all, and yet almost no one takes it. But this makes no sense from a logical perspective. But from an emotional perspective, where all decisions are truly made, it can make all the sense in the world if that sense is powerful enough. All you have to do is find some justification, and you can make just about anything make sense to anyone. A highly emotional value with velocity behind it is far superior to one that is logical and stagnant. If left unchecked, it leads to all of the previous scenarios and many more. Distilled down to a single word, the reason why all things go wrong in a society, the root issue of all the other issues, is the following: idolatry. Idolatry, the elevation of an inferior value over a superior value, is the reason why our society has gone into a tailspin. We have simply made a conscious effort to exchange more important things for less important things. It's that simple. You exchange your loving wife and corresponding marriage for a fling with a 22-year-old with daddy issues. You deprive your partners of honesty and a chance to right the ship for a quick fix that will land all of you in prison. You tell your child what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear. All of these situations have one thing in common: idolatry, the exchange of a less valuable thing for a more valuable thing. The scariest thing about idols is that they can be made about just about anything. Your religious faith, your work, your spouse, your children, your ambitions, your laziness, your consumption habits, the very things you eat and drink. It is up to each person to be self-aware enough to diagnose where their idols tend to pop up and to deal with them properly, which is why, unfortunately, almost no one does deal with them. The first place we see idolatry occur is in Christianity. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites foolishly replaced the God who delivered them from Egypt with a golden calf, mocking God by dancing around it and engaging in orgiastic sex. It is only through the intercession of their spiritual leader Moses, the only one who didn't succumb to idolatry, that they are spared. This pattern repeats throughout the Bible through great heroes such as Joshua, Elijah, David, Samuel, and of course Jesus Christ. Christians also have the correct answers on how to respond to idolatry. That response must be decisive, swift, and vicious. The Bible says the following words on how faithful Christians dealt with idols: burn, destroy, rip, tear, and more. You cannot be nice with idolatry. You must crush it, and crush it fast. There is a reason for this. Idolatry, when left to its own devices, will multiply and spawn, swallowing everything truly valuable whole, snuffing it out for everyone. This also begs another question. What is the most likely idol for someone to have? Most would think that it is something they love, something they cling to for comfort in times of crisis, and this is an understandable guess. However, I see another side of it. Whenever you see someone grasp at something for quote-unquote comfort, it's really not. Comfort is not desperate. Comfort is easy. Instead, when someone reaches for something, when someone idolizes something, rather, it speaks to something else: fear. The most likely idol for any person is the thing that they fear the most. In my case, for example, I made idols out of food and pornography for most of my life due to an immense fear of lack and loneliness. Food and porn were my escapes, the only things that could make me feel better. I have had to kill those idols more times than I could have ever imagined, because that is what is required. It's like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head and two take its place. This is exactly why idolatry is a spiritual issue. It can't be totally killed. You must fight all the time. Extrapolated out to others, we can see this in nearly every other idol that exists. Drug addicts, for example, pawn their belongings for fentanyl out of fear of withdrawal. Young children cling to their parents for the first time they walk into kindergarten because they fear the unknown. Young women cling to social media and young men to video games because they fear being by themselves. It's not comfort they're seeking. It's the avoidance of pain. So given this, the biggest question must be asked. What is America's biggest idol? Where have we elevated something so high that it has displaced every other set of values that should be in its place? Where have we feared to tread? As with the issues of what is the greatest sin, there are a million ways we could go, and all of them would have a claim to the throne. But like with idolatry, there is still one that is America's ultimate idol, the one we fear more than any other. The thing Americans fear talking about, and therefore the thing Americans have idolized more than any other, particularly recently, is race. Race, as correctly pointed out by both dishonest and honest actors, is the cardinal sin of America's history. While we shouldn't cram it down the throats of preschoolers that they're bad people because of their skin color, for example, we should be educated on our history enough to understand that a grave evil was done to minorities in America, most especially black Americans. Even though it's not true, the greatest fear for America is for it to be deemed a racist country. It has always been this way, but especially now. In that same vein, the greatest fear of Americans is being called a racist. Americans, particularly conservative and dissenting liberal Americans, have lived in this fear for more than a decade. In our current culture, it has been race which has been weaponized as America's biggest fear to craft an idol of immense proportions by immense actors who want to use it to destroy this country. Race has been the ultimate boogeyman, the unbeatable trump card in any cultural conversation over the past decade. Inquiring into the demographics when it comes to violent crime, shut up, racist. Wanting to know why the single motherhood rate for black communities is so high, shut up, racist. Wanting to visit a historical monument, shut up, racist. This has led to a namesake pioneered by people such as Steve Deace and Jason Whitlock that has been the most forbidden subject to broach: racial idolatry. America, particularly recently, has turned skin color, not content of character, into an idol. This is not the only one, to be clear. We're going to be talking about those throughout the entire show. But race is, by far, America's biggest idol, one we must destroy if we're going to get anywhere constructive, no matter what skin color a person is. To do so, we must analyze some of the biggest hydra heads of racial idolatry and just how corrosive they've been to the cultural cohesion of American life. The greatest idol America has made out of race has been George Floyd. That fateful day when Derek Chauvin was filmed kneeling on George Floyd in May of 2020 changed the trajectory of America. Immediately upon release, cities went up in flames. Entire presidential campaigns were altered. People were thrown into digital or physical prison for dissenting beliefs about race. Derek Chauvin was thrown into prison on what most deem wrongful charges, although justice should certainly still have been served. Immediately after Floyd's death, the American left used him as a martyr and symbol of right-wing anti-white rage. The police were racist. They needed to be defunded. There were thousands of George Floyds per year. This was just the only one they'd gotten on tape. It was no longer enough to not be a racist. Now, you had to be an anti-racist. It was no longer about being diverse and inclusive in your hiring process. You now had to be quote-unquote equitable, a word that no one, still to this day, can clearly define or understand. Never mind that, even though he was elevated to saint-like status, Floyd himself was far from a saint. His criminal record and rap sheet were a mile long. He was a drug addict, had fentanyl in his bloodstream the day of his death. None of that mattered to the racial idolaters. All that mattered was that George Floyd was useful to them, the modern version of the golden calf. Never mind all the gripes that black America legitimately could take claim to, most of which were economic and familial in nature. Skin color was all that mattered. George Floyd looked a certain way, so they made him to be a certain thing. The damage from the inaugural racial idolatry elevation of George Floyd still lingers to this day. $2 billion in property damage was done in the immediate aftermath during the quote-unquote Summer of Love. Active duty police effectively entered a war zone against the very citizens they were designated to protect, with police recruitment falling to all-time lows across the country, particularly in urban areas where police presence was most needed. Anti-white racism reached a fever pitch, particularly when it came to corporate HR departments and higher education admissions, notwithstanding social media posts and companies, which allowed all of that venom to be spewed, as long as it wasn't at them. But the greatest damage that the George Floyd incident caused was cultural. Americans, to the contrary of much of the narrative that was spun after his death, have been trying to move away from a race-focused society. Americans are good people. The vast majority of us don't care a single bit about what color you are. We want people to do well and to succeed. It's why the American dream is called such, and it's why so many people want to move here. But as soon as the George Floyd incident took place and Black Lives Matter capitalized, that all changed. In the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, we had ripped open a long-closed wound and had the audacity to ask ourselves why it hurt to do so. Americans, particularly white Americans, began to live in fear of being called a bigot, a racist, or some sort of phobe. Slowly but surely, this extended to all other ethnic minorities, religions, sexual orientations, and political parties. The woke reign of terror was at the peak of its power. Anyone's head could be in the guillotine if they said the wrong thing. The second greatest American idol America has made out of race is Karmelo Anthony. And no, not the basketball player. Karmelo Anthony is a 17-year-old native of Frisco, Texas, who is currently undergoing a trial for the murder of Austin Metcalf. Metcalf, the MVP linebacker of his school's football team with a 3.97 GPA, as well as being a professing Christian, was stabbed to death by Anthony earlier this year about getting into a verbal altercation at a track meet. When Metcalf held his ground, Anthony pulled out a knife and stabbed Metcalf in the heart in front of his twin brother. Metcalf collapsed, and after several people attempted to help at the scene, died minutes after arriving to a local area hospital. Anthony, to his credit, surrendered to the police shortly afterwards, where he broke down sobbing, saying that Metcalf had quote-unquote put his hands on him and disrespected him. Due to Texas law, Anthony was charged and prosecuted as an adult for murder and was placed under house arrest. After the Metcalf killing, the unbelievable happened. The social justice warriors went after the victim, not after Karmelo Anthony. Both of Metcalf's parents were swatted numerous times, with his father at one point having guns drawn on him upon his opening the door. He, along with Anthony's dad, was forced to leave his job. Upon having a press conference advocating on behalf of his son, Anthony's father successfully booted him off the property, saying that it was quote-unquote disrespectful to his son, who had murdered his child. But the most stunning part by far was the public outreach and outcry. In early May, Anthony's Give, Send, Go fundraiser to pay his legal defense had collected over $500,000. Anthony is, like all people, innocent until proven guilty, obviously. But unlike the other incidents where the scenario is popped off, there is hardly any dispute as to what actually went down. It's cut and dry. However, to our racial idolaters, that mattered very little. On both sides of the aisle, mind you. After Metcalf's death, a group called quote-unquote Protect White Americans held a protest at Metcalf's high school football stadium. Just as if the group were called quote-unquote Protect Black Americans, this did nothing but further enhance racial idolatry, just as the Ku Klux Klan or any other white nationalist or supremacist organization would. Metcalf's father, to his great credit, disavowed the effort. Finally, the straw that I believe will break the back of racial idolatry will be the victims of the Cincinnati riots we've seen throughout the past month. In a story that has since swept the nation unlike many others I've ever seen, the aftermath of the Cincinnati Brawl, which left several white victims severely hospitalized, including women, are showing just how deep the racial idolatry movement has sunk. Details are still being parsed out as to how the brawl started, but the fact remains the same. Unprovoked physical violence is bad. Unprovoked physical violence towards women is worse. The videos, if you haven't seen them, are horrifying. People getting stomped on, kicked, punched, heads slamming onto concrete, and most horrifyingly of all, no one stepping in to stop the madness, to stop these horrifying acts from happening. Most shamefully, from the mostly male crowd that surrounded the assault. A reasonable question to ask would be the following. Why? Why did no one step in, particularly the men? Well, maybe, just maybe, it's because they didn't want to end up as another Derek Chauvin or Austin Metcalf. No one wants to say the quiet part out loud about just what the reaction from our chattering class would have been if the races on these victims would have been inverted. Cincinnati would have been on fire. Our elites from business, media, and politics would have used this as a prop nonstop to pander to the racial idolatry crowd. But when it's white people, it's an entirely different story. This is a problem, not just because it involves white people or because I am a white person. I don't care about my skin color, and I don't care about yours. I care about the elevation of skin color as America's ultimate value, because it's not America's ultimate value. America's values of excellence, justice, the pursuit of happiness are all far superior to things we can't control, such as the color of our skin. We've sadly forgotten this recently. Idolatry, as it does with anything, corrodes all that it touches. Particularly with a subject as sensitive to Americans as race, values need to reign supreme in the conversation. Every person, no matter what they look like, is deserving of, at minimum, equal rights under the law, and if you're a Christian, the status of a child and image bearer of God, which everyone is, and what they are. Racial idolatry discards this. Values aren't used to elevate, but to denigrate. Many have succumbed to racial idolatry as an act of compassion, particularly young people. This is easy enough to understand. Young people are the most open to compassion, and they're the most naive to these being very ancient and deep concepts. But idolatry of any kind, racial or not, is the least compassionate thing you can embody. It is the opposite, total degradation and humiliation. It takes all nuance, all opportunities to rise out of the equation, and forces a caricatured and demonic narrative onto people who may or may not fit that description. It's disgusting, and it's wrong. Idolatry is dangerous because it blinds us to the truth. Idolatry convinces people that nothing they do and nothing that they value matters. It's all just baked into the cake, completely unable to change. Nothing could be further from the truth. When you put something on a pedestal, you open it up to judgment, just like we do with anything else. If the thing that you elevate cannot be questioned, it's not a value. It is an idol. The truth is the thing we most need to combat idolatry. If we cannot have a truthful conversation about values and whether they're steering us in a positive or negative direction, we should not have a conversation at all. If we do not tear down the idols in our own lives, we can expect that those idols will begin to consume us, our families, our communities, and our country. It's not a matter of if it will happen, but when it will happen.